welcome back, friends. Today it's the Abloom Quilts Trunk Show video. I'm really excited to share all of the new patterns with you. I have 7 new patterns for the release of these fabrics. If you missed last week's fabric preview, be sure and check that out. I have that linked down below so you can see all the new pretty fabrics. But today it's going to be all about all of the new quilt patterns. We've got jelly roll patterns, fat eighth, layer cake, charm pack, yardage, a new barn star, a little bit of everything. So we're going to have fun taking a peek at those. Before we dive into that, I am going to do a viewer question of the video today. This is a fun one, and I think it will help a lot of you get some ideas. This comes from Diane M. HY4NP, and she says, "Hi, what suggestions do you have for someone wanting to complete their quilt totally on their own and not able to send it out? Your quilts are beautiful. I just ordered jelly roll and peachy keen fabric. Thank you." This is a great question, Diane, because I know that not everyone is able to send their quilts out, or some people really just prefer not to send quilts out. They prefer to do the whole quilt themselves from start to finish. So whether you're making this decision because sending quilts out to be quilted can be costly, or whether you fall in the camp that you prefer to finish your quilt all on your own from start to finish, we do have some different options for how we can choose to complete our quilts. I've got a couple different samples here. I would say primarily what you're looking at is knotting a quilt. You can machine quilt your own quilt on your domestic machine. And that could be either quilting the whole thing all across once the quilt top is completed, or doing it quilt as you go, which allows you to quilt smaller chunks of your quilt as you are piecing it. And then the other way that we could do is hand quilting. So a few different options that we have. I've got a little bit of examples here. This first one makes me laugh, but this is an example of knotting a quilt. One of my very first quilts, probably once I started making quilts, was this flannel log cabin quilt. It's knotted. The knots are a little crazy. Like, you can definitely choose less noticeable knots by choosing a finer thread or even a crochet thread to knot your quilt. And this secures all of your layers on the front and the back. From the back, if you have a busier backing, you're not even really going to notice where those little knots are at. But that is how it would look on the back. I have a few different quilts that have been knotted. It's nice, user-friendly approach to finishing a quilt. And, you know, depending on the yarn you choose and the size, the chunkiness of what you're knotting with, you're going to have a different look. For all of these techniques, ways of finishing a quilt I am mentioning, you're going to be able to find YouTube videos or even picture websites that would walk you through how to approach any of these techniques. We are so fortunate to have these ways of learning available to us now that we didn't have previously. So if I mention something and you like the technique but you're not sure where to start, I would start by sourcing a video tutorial that would get you going. So this is knotting a quilt. We will just go to hand quilting next because I have that one next on my stack here. So you can hand quilt your quilt. A lot of people are intimidated by hand quilting, but it's not actually as difficult as you might think that it is. I have a 4-part video series here on my channel about hand quilting, and it goes over everything from choosing supplies to the technique to you know, all the things that you might want to know about hand quilting. And I'm not the only one that has a hand quilting video here on YouTube. There are lots of hand quilting resources. So if you wanted to hand quilt your quilt, you could certainly do that. This is an example of a long stitch hand quilted quilt. Let me hold this one up. This pattern is one that I have available for free. It was a Moda Bake Shop quilt pattern. So I will track down that tutorial so that if you wanted to make this quilt, you could. And then hand quilting, I will also link to my videos on hand quilting if that was something that you wanted to try. But you can see what this looks like. I like hand quilting using these bigger stitches. It adds such a nice amount of texture to a quilt, color to a quilt. There are multicolored threads here. So we have green quilting here and aqua and red, and it just adds a lot of interest to a quilt. I also find that this long stitching The bigger stitches are easier than the smaller stitches that you might be more familiar with hand quilting. But whether you are doing big stitches or small stitches, the technique is the same. You're simply choosing slightly different quilting supplies in regard to your needle and your thread choices. So that is another option available to you to finish your quilt. And then the last two that I had mentioned both fall under the machine quilting category. One is Quilt As You Go. I don't have an example of that. There's a wealth of information available to you in regard to Quilt As You Go, even books written on the topic. I will track down those books too, because there are some books that I can recommend that I have looked at in regard to Quilt As You Go. So I will link to those as well. But that just allows you to do small pieces that you are machine quilting. And then typically you would be using a sashing, that you would be attaching those small quilted chunks together using sashing to complete your larger project. And so you're not having to wrangle a big project through your quilt. So it's a really nice technique. And there's just a lot of great information. The other thing is wrangling your whole quilt when you machine quilt. So you could complete your top as normal and then machine quilt your quilt on your domestic sewing machine. This is one that I did myself on my domestic sewing machine. At the time, I just had a really beginner Bernina sewing machine. My throat space on that machine is, I think I measured it. I don't think it's any wider than 6 inches. It's very narrow throat space. So it really was tricky to get the quilt through the machine, but it's certainly doable. I didn't need to have a long arm or purchase anything additional. A lot of thread. It takes a fair amount of thread to machine quilt, but I had all of the supplies that I needed on hand. Again, tons of information about machine quilting on your domestic sewing machine, which would just be the sewing machine that you are using to do your piecing. You can also, if you find that you really enjoy doing a lot of long arm, it wouldn't be long arm till you move to a long arm, but that's where I'm going with this. If you find that you really enjoy machine quilting, you could invest in a long arm quilting machine, which some people do find that they quite enjoy and do make that investment. If you're making a lot of quilts, that investment will pay itself off, as sending quilts out to a long arm quilter can be costly. This quilt is another free pattern. This one is available on my website. I released it in conjunction with my Playful Petals book. So by having that book, you would have the information that you need for the applique, and then I had the remainder of the pattern available for free on my blog. So I will link to that as well. But definitely the biggest quilt that I have machine quilted. I just used a little swirly little pattern. It wasn't anything too tricky. So that is the roundup of ways that you could complete your quilt pattern, complete your quilt top after you have finished it. Again, so many great tutorials and videos online that you can gain information, practice things. I especially think there's wonderful things about machine quilting because you can find just about anything you want on machine quilting techniques, different, do I want to use swirls, straight lines, squiggles, what have you, and then how to approach it, ways to get better at your free motion quilting, just so much good information. So if that is something that you want to try, you can always start small when you're trying new techniques, whether it's hand quilting, machine quilting, even Quilt As You Go. I did a small project with Quilt As You Go just so you can get a feel for the technique. So start with pillows or table runners or small wall hangings so that you can try it out on a small project, see what you think, kind of dip your toes in the water, and then decide if it's something that you want to do on something larger. So thank you for that great question, Diane. I think that is going to help other quilters decide how they might want to finish their projects and to know that we have different options available to us. I had another question that kept popping up on last week's video about the Abloom fabric, so I thought I would also take a little bit of time just to chat about those questions before we move into the quilts. And it happened to be about the panel I shared from Abloom last week. So this is the Abloom panel, and two questions were asked pretty frequently. The first question was, exactly how much yardage do I need to purchase if I want the full repeat of block motifs? If you purchase 1 yard, you will have 20 different blocks. 1 yard of the Abloom fabric, panel fabric, will give you all 20 of the blocks. So you can see right here, this is from one end to the other, and you need 1 yard of fabric. The other question that I got was, what size are we cutting these down to? And I cut my panel squares at 7 inches for both of the patterns you're going to see in today's video. And this was a new ruler that I used. I never encourage people to buy a specialty ruler unless it's something that you really think is going to benefit you. I really do like having specific rulers for cutting panel squares because I want them to be nice and straight, and I don't want to spend a lot of time fussing trying to get them straight. So I do tend to purchase more specialty rulers for cutting panels than I probably do for anything else. So this was one I was trying out with this panel. This, I'm not sure what it's some OmniGrid fussy cut ruler or something to that effect. I'm going to look that up and link to it below. And I'm actually going to be sharing a more complete video about this ruler, but I wanted to chat just a little bit about it so you can see the cutting size with this panel, since that kept coming up in questions last week. So right here, I cut, as I said, 7-inch squares for all of these. And the outside edge of this ruler is 7.5. This ruler comes in a set of 2. So one ruler has all of the odd numbered measurements, both half size and full size. So you can cut 7.5 if you do the exterior, or if you do the little dots here, you can cut 7 inches. And again, I'm not going into a tutorial on how to use this ruler. I'll be sharing that later, but rather I wanted to show you the space that you have when cutting at 7 inches. So 1/4 inch in from the edge is your 7-inch mark. This ruler allowed me to really nicely line everything up because of these portions. Let me get the light off there. These portions of this ruler. So these allowed me to really straighten these blocks up and cut them nice and straight because I could place that frosted portion right on my X's. These X's are just under 1/4 inch. So by centering those, I could really make sure everything was straight and even, both horizontally and vertically. So that was the way I cut these. Now you can see right here is where the edge, 1/4 inch in here, is how much space you're going to have between that and the next panel motif. So then when I slide this over here, you're going to have, a nice amount of space in between the blocks, cutting them at 7 inches. Now, you might be wondering why I didn't go wider than that. I could have gone a bit wider than that. The reason for that is that I really do like to have the space to straighten. Sometimes you might have a motif that didn't print quite straight, or maybe on the edge, on your outside edge where it has been cut off the bolt, maybe you're a little bit short there. And then the other thing too is up here in your selvage. Sometimes you don't have the same amount of space, like you can see right here. You don't have the same amount of space between the selvage as you might have between the 2 blocks. So with all of those things combined, I find it nicest to cut things a little bit smaller, making sure that you have plenty of space around the edge of your star points or block points, and then adding borders to make the blocks bigger as you might need them. So that's exactly what I did. You're going to see in the patterns that I am sharing that I have bordered out my blocks to bring them up to the size I need. That means that if I wanted to use this in the center of something much bigger, I could, because I can just add borders and make it the size I need it. This background fabric matches Motabella Solid in the color 200. So that means that you'll have a seam if you add borders in that color, but once it's all quilted, it really does look more solid than you might expect. And you can also choose to add something fun, a floral print or a stripe or something like that, to border your blocks as well. So that is how I approach this panel, and I wanted to share that information with you. All right, I'm going to get this folded back up, and then we are going to move into the new Abloom quilts. Kicking off the Abloom quilts with this Jelly Roll Dash quilt. This, as the name implies, is a jelly roll quilt, and then you also need your background fabric and a little bit of fabric for your sashing. This is a larger quilt. It finishes at 78 by 93, and it's just a fun scrappy jelly roll quilt. You could also easily convert this into a really scrappy quilt using scraps from your scrap bin. It lends itself well to using those 2.5-inch by whatever width cutoffs you might have left from previous projects. So a really fun scrappy quilt. I'm gonna bring this down and we are going to take a look at the quilting and talk about all the fun things. Here is what Jelly Dash looks like. Up close, you can really see that quilting design on here. The quilting design is called Vintage Crosshatch. It's by So Shabby Quilting. I will have that information linked in the description box below. But you can see it's just a fun circle crosshatch design. I think it's really pretty on here. Now for the background of this quilt, I chose that beige sketch fabric from Abloom and the same print in the beige for the sashing and then for the corners of each churn dash block. Let's take a look at the backing and the binding, and then I'm going to talk about the pattern just a little bit. So for the backing, it is the large scale print on the light gray, and the binding is that same sketchy print, but in the coral. Now, let me chat just a bit about the patterns. If you've been watching Coriander Quilt's channel for any length of time, you may have remembered that earlier this year, I mentioned that I was no longer going to be using the intermediate, beginner, advanced, quilting level designations on the back of my patterns. And instead, I was going to be changing that to include quilting skills used so that you could make the determination on your own whether a quilt pattern is for you or maybe one that you're going to pass or put off for a little bit until your quilting skills improve or it's something you want to tackle at a later date. So you're going to see that change made with this round of patterns and going forward. So you will see here on the back, you're going to find the name of the quilt pattern and then the size of the completed quilt. That's the same as what it would have been previously. Also, the fabric collection used on my front cover. Some of you aren't aware that I include that information on the back of my patterns. So if you ever pick up one of my patterns, you know what fabric collection I used on the cover. That information isn't changing. But what you see that is new is this section right here. So I've noted Jelly Dash quilting skills used. You're going to see what the finished sizes of the blocks are right here on the back of the pattern. Often this would be information that is included on the inside of the pattern. It still is. I'm not changing that, but I'm also including it here on the back, so that you know these blocks here, the churn dash block is a 12-inch finished block, and these little sashing blocks are 3-inch finished blocks. So that can help you determine sizes and if that's a size you're comfortable with or not. And then you're also going to see the skills used right here. So accurate 1/4-inch seam allowance, that's pretty standard across quilting patterns. But then this pattern uses a lot of half square triangles. You're going to be cutting, sewing, and pressing long, narrow strips. That's something that if you've done previously or haven't tried, can be a little bit tricky for some people if you've not done it before in keeping your strips from not being wavy. So something that you might want to know this pattern includes. And then strip piecing. Some people are comfortable cutting one piece at a time, and some people like doing strip piecing. So knowing that a pattern is written including strip piecing can be helpful information. So all of the new patterns as we go down through are going to include this quilting skills used so that you can know ahead of time what you're getting yourself into when you are purchasing one of these patterns. And I always include the back of my pattern in my Etsy shop listings so that you have all of your fabric requirements, and now you're also going to be able to see all of this information prior to purchasing the pattern. You will have all of this information available to you. I would have always had the fabric requirements included, but now you've got the additional information there. So I just wanted to make you aware of that update. I think that's going to be really nice going forward to have that information so easily available to every customer. So Jelly Dash. Now let's just move back behind me here to Chickadee. This is a bird themed quilt. Obviously with a name like Chickadee, you expected that it was going to be. Some of you saw these little blocks earlier on some of my social media. I shared them on Instagram and Facebook. They were such a fun little block to piece up. This is a fat eighth friendly quilt, another roomy quilt. This one finishes at 68 by 84. And it was a lot of fun to piece. So the birds weren't super tricky, not a lot of piecing there. And then just adding these fun rectangles of print really let the prints in Abloom shine. Before I share about the quilting on this quilt and talk about that, I want to talk about the background that I used for Chickadee. I used this little dotted square print from my coriander seeds line of fabric. I've put a piece of dark fabric underneath here so that you could hopefully see that print just a little bit better. It's the daintiest of all of the white on whites in my coriander seeds collection. And I wanted just a little teeny bit of something for that background so that it wasn't just a solid 9900, 200 Bella, but it has these cute little dotted squares throughout the whole background. Coriander Seeds is a basic collection of mine for Moda, so it's in quilt shops all the time. So if you wanted to purchase any of the Coriander Seeds white on whites, you can do that at any time in your local quilt shop. So now let's talk about that quilting. This is Retro Sheets Extended Width, I think is the full name of this quilt pattern. And it is another So Shabby quilting one, and I really like the way it looks. We ran it vertically so that it lined up kind of with these rectangles and the birds, and I just really like the change in prints as you work your way across. So it has these little flowers, then we move into this diamond shape and then flowers again. It's got little scallops as you work your way across, and I just think it's a really fun design. It's one that I have wanted to use for a while, and I thought this was the perfect quilt for this. David of Quilting by David did all of the quilting for all of my new Abloom quilts, so I will be sure and have his information linked in the description box below. Let's take a look at the backing and the binding. I have to show you guys the binding corner on this quilt because something kind of funny to me happened. I think it's funny. It threw me off though, but anyhow, I'll save that corner to show you in just a bit. But here is the backing fabric. I had to use the birdhouse to go with the birdie quilt. So it's the birdhouses on the white, and then the binding is the plaid pink binding. Now let's look at this corner. I'm going to tug it down into frame here. Do you see this little slightly stained corner right here? If you have been with me for any length of time, you know that I often take my quilt photos over on a fence, and sometimes I have horses that show up and want to be in the photo as well. And this time around, the horse showed up and he nibbled on the corner of my quilt. I didn't know he was hidden back there. It just looked like he was just munching on some grass back behind as I was taking the photos. If you want to see the photos I'm talking about, be sure to visit my blog today. I have those fence photos over there, so I'll link to that. But many of you have asked me before, do the horses ever bother your quilts? And they never have bothered before. But he was just discreetly munching away on the back of my quilt corner as I was photographing this one. This is the only one that met up with any horse issues as I was photographing the quilts, but I'm gonna have to figure out. I haven't tried washing it or even just putting it under water to see what comes out, but it's got a little grass and it needs a little attention. I don't know. He was a silly horse. It doesn't bother me that he did that. I think that should wash out just fine, but I've never had a horse nibble on my quilt before. Anyhow, I guess there's a first time for everything. I would venture to guess most of you probably aren't going to have a horse nibble on your quilt, but I have. Anyhow, all right, let's just move on to my next quilt back here. This quilt is Sweetest. It is a colorful, happy quilt. Wait till you see the quilting on this one. I love the way it turned out. I added in some of the yellow polka dot from Coriander Colors, which I love what that adds to this collection. I very seldom have a collection that doesn't include yellow in it. So it was fun having an opportunity to throw this yellow into this quilt. And I do always love a good polka dot. Isn't that quilting so pretty? This is called Feather Clam Jam. Yes, by So Shabby Quilting. And I think it's such a happy little thing. I liked it because I felt like it kind of mimicked the shape of my flowers. So that's why I went with this design, and I think it's fun. I also think that it could be really pretty on a citrus themed quilt because it does have a little bit of an orange or a lemon or lime sort of vibe to it as well. But I thought it turned out really pretty. The stems on this quilt, I used the little bitty print on green, and I think that turned out just lovely. This quilt requires a charm pack and a mini charm pack. You need both to complete this quilt, and then you need your background fabric, which for my background on this one I used the white on white print from Abloom, which is this little sketchy print, just white on white, which is beautiful. And then for the border fabric here, it's that same sketchy print, so that's the same print as the background. And then the binding is the plaid on white, and the backing is the birdie print on white. And I just love this one. I think it's such a happy flower-filled quilt. The measurement is 68 by 87 on your completed quilt, so another roomy one. And again, you know, just as with the first several patterns, fabric requirements plus the quilting skills used, and you can see those in detail over in my Etsy shop. All right, let's move on to the next quilt. This one is a fun one. A while back, well, I don't know how a while, it wasn't that long ago, I shared a little sewing machine mini quilt that was in my needs to be finished pile. You might remember this, and chatted about my poor fabric choice for the center of this quilt, and then asked you guys if you would like a pattern released for this. And you all did. You thought a pattern would be great. So we now have a pattern for this, and I'm releasing it with this collection. So this is my little Abloom in Stitches mini quilt, and I think it is just the sweetest little quilt. So you can see all of those fun buttons and spools that we have here. And the quilting on this is one of my favorites. I've used this quite often, but this is a super small scale. It is Circles Nested by Julie Hurt. And I really like using this one on jelly roll quilts at a slightly larger scale so that the circles are about the size of quarters. But I love this scale for this quilt, and this quilting design, I just think it always looks so good. So that's what the quilting is on here. And then for the backing, it's the little bitty print on the dark coral. The binding is the plaid print in pink. David of Quilting by David offers binding services on his machine quilted quilts. So when I send them to him, I also opt to have the binding completed so that when I get these quilts back, everything is done. And it's so nice to get them back completely finished. So In Stitches Mini, this one requires a charm pack, and then you need some yardage for some of the items. A little border, you need your border out here, background fabric. The background fabric that I used for this one is the little ditzy print from Coriander Seeds. These are just small little flowers. Another print that works really great with the Abloom collection. I use that quite a bit. Actually, I think you can see it really well here. I'm going to show you this quilt too, but I use the same background fabric, and I think if we lay this on this dark fabric, you're going to be able to see that print pretty nicely. So here, if you look at how these little flowers show up now, it's the same print as this one right here. So this background is the same as this print, and it's the same background that I used here for Abloom. So while we are chatting about and showing this quilt, I will hold this up. I thought this quilt pattern would also be perfect to use with Callie & Co. So I quickly contacted Becky. She was my sample maker for years, and she's no longer going to be sample making for me, and I will miss having her make samples for me. But she made this one as her last sample, and I was so thankful that she did. I pieced all of the Abloom quilts myself. I thought they were so fun, and I had a little bit of extra time, and I needed to do them quickly. So I did those all myself, and it was so nice to have her do this one last little quilt for me. So let's look at this one too, up close. The Callie & Co. fabrics, this collection here comes out next month in November. So if you think it's adorable in Callie & Co., the pattern is available now in Stitches Mini, and then these fabrics will be out in November. Abloom fabrics come out in April. Abloom fabrics, you can let your favorite quilt shops know right now to order. They are currently ordering them. So if you would love to see Abloom in your local quilt shop or your favorite online quilt shop, now is the time to let them know that you'd love them to carry those fabrics. This is Callie & Co. So that is a peek at the new sewing machine mini quilt. I think it's so cute. I love that you can get just a charm pack, pick up a charm pack, a little bit of extra yardage, and away you go. Now we have another smallish quilt to show next. This is Barn Star 9. We have 9 total Barn Stars now. They all finish at 40 inches square, and this is the one I've designed for Abloom. A nice big star, which means they piece quickly. They work really well for baby quilts, wall hangings, table toppers. Just a real fun quilt to piece and a nice quick one to piece. The quilting on this one, let me pull that over here, is called Paper Peels. It's another one by So Shabby Quilting. I have really been enjoying her quilting designs recently. So it's this straight line stitching and then orange peel. I tend to really like an orange peel, so this works really nicely on this quilt. I think that's a fun one to use. Backing on this quilt is the dark birdie print and then the plaid print in the pink for the binding. Let me hold that one up one more time. Barn Star 9. And before very long, you're going to be seeing Barn Star 10. I've started releasing these pretty consistently throughout each of my collections, so they are always fun. All right, that is Barn Star 9, and now you see behind me, we already have a new quilt hanging up. Let me grab the information on that one. The one hanging behind me is called Handiwork. It is a 68 by 85 inch quilt, and this one is a layer cake quilt. It uses 2 layer cakes plus the panel. So here we're going to get a chance to talk about that panel, and you'll be able to see how I piece that in here just a little bit better. The quilting on this is called Diagonal Twist. It's another one by So Shabby Quilting. And then here you can see how these blocks look within a quilt. So we have the panel square here, bordered out by Motabella Solid in the color 200 to bring it to the size we need to go with these layer cake squares. This is just a really simple way to add just a little bit of fun stitchy goodness to an otherwise simple layer cake quilt. I have added embroidery to quilts previously, and I always think it's really pretty. And I think this is fun because it mimics the look of embroidery without having to take the time to actually do the embroidery. So this quilt is the layer cake, two layer cakes plus 1 yard of the panel fabric. One Abloom panel is 1 yard. And then you'll have it. The backing for this quilt is that beautiful large scale print on the dark green. I think this is so striking, this print. I love this print in all of the colors, but I think that's just really pretty. For the binding, it is the plaid print on the aqua. That is Handiwork up close. Behind me, we have the last of the new quilts. This one is called Yesteryear. And I wanted a quilt that felt super traditional, that really highlighted the panel and was pretty simple to piece, but looked a little bit more complex. Adding those panel squares in there does create a quilt that looks trickier than it actually is, because it does look like you might have spent time hand embroidering this, but you've really just pieced a little bit into your quilt. This quilt finishes at 59 by 70.5, and we used a small scale orange peel for this quilt, and it turned out so pretty. It reads super traditional, but which I love. That's exactly what I was going for. Look at all of that beautiful texture that orange peel gives to this quilt. That is just so pretty. A small scale orange peel. Small scale orange peel is one of my favorites to use on quilts. It works so well for so many different quilting designs. You can go big, you can go small, and it's just so pretty. The sashing fabric is the sketchy print on the aqua. The background is 9900, Bella Solid 9900, and then just your panel squares. For the border, I use that large scale print on the aqua. The binding is the plaid print on white, and the backing is the birdhouse print on aqua. So a very aqua filled quilt, but I think it turned out pretty. It's exactly how I wanted it to look. Super traditional and just really soft and pretty. So this is the last of the new Abloom patterns. The name of this last one is Yesteryear. I don't think I had mentioned the name of it yet. So it is Yesteryear, and the last of the 7 new quilt patterns. Let me know which one is your favorite. You've got a lot to choose from in this batch. We've got a total of 7, as I said. In the Etsy shop, you're going to find all of them available to purchase. I have both paper or PDF versions available, and I also have a 7-piece bundle set at a little bit of a discount if you think you might want all 7 of the new quilt patterns. I've got that information linked in the description box below. I'd love to hear which one is your favorite, so let me know, and if you have any questions for me, I'm happy to answer those. Thank you so much for stopping by, and I will catch you again next time.